Okay.
Makes you think, how did we ever learn? I say back in the dark age.
Hi everybody again. Today is March 10th, 2012, 16th of Adar 5772. I'm Rabbi Art Levine, and this is the second session of Opening the Jewish Treasure Chest, the Siddur. So let's start with the prayer before studying Torah. Everybody have a copy? Yeah. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah v'ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'fiamcha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu v'tze'etzaenu v'tze'etza'ei amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishmach Baruch atah Adonai Amlamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Should we do the English, or you're comfortable with just the Hebrew?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so go ahead and pass those together. So 2 weeks ago, seems like a long time ago, we talked about what the Siddur is. A history book, elements of rituals for daily life and life cycle events and songs and so on. More than just a prayer book. And we taught. I just wanted to think a minute or two in this, sort of get us in the frame of mind so we can continue on. And we talked about what prayer was. Of course, many people think about prayer as being petition to God, which it can be, but in Hebrew it's more of a self-reflective activity to move us from ego consciousness to soul consciousness, to try to help remind us that we're actually souls with bodies and not people with souls. And the word lahitpalel has to do with judging and discerning and making a difference in our lives as to what's trivial and what's important. So in that context, the Siddur then becomes a kind of a self-help, soul-oriented guide, which has been compiled, we'll see in a moment, over the centuries, and really sort of reflects an encounter with Jewish souls and history. So I thought we would start with a history of Jewish prayer, briefly, and sort of tie it to Jewish history. But actually, before I pass out my summary, let's just what do people think in terms of our history and the Siddur? Do you make any connections between what may have happened at any time in our history, going all the way back to the beginning, Bereshit, or any other time you identify as history, and did it affect prayer, the way in which we communicated with God? Do you have any preconceptions, I guess, what I'm asking about how history, Jewish history, and prayer in the Siddur may have some connection?
When the temple was gone, we had different needs than when the temple was there.
Okay, so what was it about the temple, when the temple was...
It might have been a focus, should have been a focus of prayer.
Prayer replace sacrifices.
Okay, and prayer replaced sacrifice, and we think about sacrifices. How could slaughtering animals have anything to do with prayer? I mean, thinking of prayer replacing sacrifices.
And do you think there was
Better than
a prayer
sacrificing
while
human beings.
Better, okay.
there was a prayer while they were slaughtering the animals? It could be
Yeah,
that
but
there was
it's a modern perspective,
Yeah, that was tradition.
Okay, right. So ancient cultures, this is how you connected with God. I mean, we don't sacrifice our food now. Obviously, when we go to the grocery store, we're totally disconnected from, unless I guess you're a farmer, from how we get our food. But anciently, of course, you were intimately involved, and you could see, saying, I have this food, I'm going to give some of it to God in thanks and so on.
They also shared it with the priest.
Right.
And Levites all got portions of the sacrifices that were there.
Right.
They didn't have any earnings
Right.
to really guess they didn't charge them to give out lessons.
Okay, so what about after the temple? We mentioned already prayer replaced it. But any other event in Jewish history, do you think, why do we have a Siddur? How did it
We need some order.
I'm only guessing that with the diaspora, it was a way of keeping a standard form of prayer among this group of people.
Ah, okay, good point.
Connecting people who were going to different places, different countries.
Interesting. Okay. Hi, Ann. How about? I agree with you. I think you're both right. How about technology? Do you think of any technology issues that might have affected?
None whatsoever. Look.
The Siddur. The Siddur.
You mean the printing press?
Yeah, the printing press. Okay, so before the printing press, how would there have been a standardization? I mean, what were things?
Same way they make the Torah.
What were things? Okay, so you scroll. It would have been very difficult, been expensive and cumbersome to use. And you can think about having a book. We can just flip pages and that sort of thing. So we had events in our history, and we also had sort of world history events and technology. So those are some of the things that we'll see affected this year. So why don't I go ahead and pass this out, and we'll just sort of breeze through Jewish history on the things that seem to be relevant to this. I have 4 of them here. And, should have asked everybody to please turn their cell phones on silent or vibrate. I think I made 8 copies. And
That's the 8th one then.
and I think I'm holding on to the 8th one.
No.
So can we?
I'll look at that.
Okay, all right,
Look on with mine.
great.
Whatever, okay.
Okay, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to hit some highlights here. So the first thing, it's always, we think about how old our history is, and there's debate about the patriarchs and when they lived, and even whether they ever actually were people or whether they're archetypes. There are all sorts. But assuming that we accept that our patriarchs and matriarchs were real people, and the time period, we're talking about almost 4,000 years of history that we have. And as we've already pointed out, during the biblical period, the mode of connecting to God was primarily sacrifices. But we do have some prayers in Torah. And by that I mean the 5 books of Moses. Can you think of any examples of prayers in Torah?
Shema.
Is Shema a prayer? What is the Shema? Well, of course, we'll be going through it in detail. But what is Shema? What does it say in Hebrew? I mean, what is it? No, I know the words. Thank you. I've heard them once or twice.
Actually, it's a statement.
God, the Lord is when?
It's more of a statement of belief as opposed to.
Well, first of all, who said? Okay, it's a statement. Who made it? And to who made it, and to whom?
Didn't God make it to Moses? I'm sorry.
No.
I thought the Shema was calling the congregation to serious prayer now, that we're really, everybody really listen now, we're going to really begin the service.
That's the Baruch Hu. That's the Baruch Hu. Okay, the Baruch Hu is the call to prayer. And we'll talk about that eventually. But the word Baruch Hu, remember last time we talked about what does this word Baruch mean? It seems to have to do with kneeling or the knee or bending. I mean, it's difficult to translate into English. But the Baruch Hu is the imperative form of the word. So the prayer leader is telling everybody in the congregation, Baruch Hu, praise, bless, Baruch Hu et Adonai Varach. Praise or bless the one who is blessed. Now the interesting thing. So then the congregation responds Baruch. Okay, so that's not the imperative. they are responding by blessing God. Now, interesting, I'll just add this. If you watch the choreography when you're in services, what happens? At Baruch, okay, the rabbi and the cantor and the people in the bima bow, and everybody in the congregation bows too. But that's only because they don't realize what they're saying. The Baruch is the command by the people on the, praise or bless. The people in the congregation don't bow. They're not saying it. Unless you say that they're saying it, everybody's saying it to everybody else, and then we're all bowing because of But we're really, so then the Baruch is the response. It's a call and response. And the Baruch is when the congregation responds and bows. So that's really what should be happening in the sanctuary. You don't bow at Baruch, you do bow at Baruch because you're responding to the call. Okay. But that's the call to prayer that you're talking about. Now Shema is also in the imperative form. It's actually Shema, not Shema. And so it's the imperative form, and it means listen. And Moses is telling the assemblage, listen. Adonai our God, Adonai is one. So it's not a prayer. It's imprecation. That'd be the right word. It's sort of listen, you people. Okay. So that's a long answer with no. That's not a prayer in Torah. But it's a good thought. Any other suggestions of somebody who we would say made a request or a plea or something to God in Torah?
We got extracts relative within the High Holiday.
Okay, well let me give you a couple of examples. So, for example, Moses prays when Miriam is afflicted, and Moses says to God, heal Miriam. Please, God, please heal her. Okay. Another example is when Hannah prays to God for a son and says, give me a son, I'll dedicate him to the priesthood. And another example is when Solomon is crowned. We're moving into Tanakh now from Torah. Solomon asks for wisdom. And another example is when
the blessings of the sons.
Yes, blessings, but I'm distinguishing blessings from a prayer per se. And another example earlier in Genesis is when Jacob is concerned and asks God for protection and says, if you see me through, then I will build you an altar and I'll know that you're my God, and so on. So here are 4 examples. Why I mention this is these are all sort of free-form expressions where the character in Torah just speaks from the heart, and there's no repeat. I mean, this is not a stylized prayer. There's no words verbatim. It's just an expression. So my point is that in Torah, at least, the idea of prayer is just this spontaneous, extemporaneous expression. And that was the model for 2,000 years. We didn't have a Siddur per se. We had mostly extemporaneous expressions. And, of course, the main way of prayer, as we point out, was sacrifices. So just to run through the first page here, so we have the patriarchs. Then, at about 3,000 years ago, at least according to our tradition, David writes the Psalms, of which there were many, and eventually the books of Psalms, there was a compilation made. It ended up being 150 in our canonized book of Psalms, the Tehillim. Whether David actually wrote them is subject to debate. In any event, Solomon builds the temple, and then the next event will have important implications for the Siddur. And that is, we have splitting between the northern and the southern kingdom. I don't know if you all realize that we got Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And even today in our prayers, we say, God, arise to protect Judah and Israel, referring to the two kingdoms. Then Assyria conquers Israel, the northern kingdom, and there's the 10 lost tribes, so-called, sort of disappear from history. And then a really critical event, which we'll talk about why that's important soon, is the destruction of the first temple in 586 and the Babylonian exile. Then about 50 years later or so, the Messiah. Did you know that the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, actually identifies who the Messiah is?
No. Who is it?
Cyrus. Cyrus, the king of Persia, is identified in the book of Isaiah as the Messiah. Or Mashiach, the anointed one, which is what Messiah actually means. And he allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. But many do not go. They stay in Babylonia. And that would be a critical fact for Jewish history, the Talmud, for the Siddur, we'll see. So some Jews come back to Israel or Persia. And then a few hundred years later, the Maccabees established the Second Commonwealth. We're still in the sacrificial period. Now, about this time, apparently, archaeologists are saying synagogues started to develop. And excuse me.
After the first.
Well, it's not clear exactly when, but in the few centuries before the last few centuries of the Second Temple, a synagogue started to develop. And these were not synagogues as we think of them, run by rabbis. The rabbis were more of an elite group who were on their own sort of studying. And the synagogue was more of a social gathering place for communal events. And there were some prayers that were led by lay pray leaders. And again, they didn't have a siddur. There were themes that had evolved, and they would extemporize. And the sort of model is jazz. I'm not a musician, but if you know about jazz, at least what I understand of jazz, is the idea of jazz is there's a lot of improvisation around themes, right? So you might have a jazz leader who will set a theme for music, and then the other members of the band will extemporize around that theme with their instruments. Does that sound familiar? Okay, jazz improvisation. That's what we had during this time in prayer improvisation. So the prayer leader might, from one day to the next or 1 week to the next, there were certain themes that were repeated, but there were very few set words. All right, so then the devastating event of 70. So we're now 2,000 years, the first 2,000 years of Jewish history, and Rome destroys the Second Temple. And this academy in Yavne, a little town, at least this is the history according to Pirkei Avot, the academy is founded. And as I put in my little notes here, the rabbis have probably established some liturgy and the order of its recitation. Liturgy comes from Greek, meaning public work. Avodah, service, also means work.
So when this first synagogues appear, the first prayers were written, or what did they use for prayers?
Well, I think that
Did they read them from Torah, or were they separate prayers written?
the scholars say that there were themes. Some there were the Shema was recited, the Ten Commandments were probably recited, some Psalms were probably recited, and then each local synagogue probably had its custom, and then within that, the prayer leaders improvised or extemporized. But remember, there was no printing press. It was, you didn't have everybody having the same scroll, so it was a completely different environment than what we're thinking about. Okay, next page. So it was it you, Marilyn? I forget who said that after the destruction of the temple, there was a sense of a need to keep our tradition alive, establish some order. So not focusing on prayer so much, but more generally, all of our traditions, there was a great fear, especially after the devastating revolts, the Bar Kokhba revolts, in which statistically Jews lost more Jews than the Holocaust in terms of the population-wise. It was, you can't compare disasters, but just demographically, it was a worse, and so there was a great danger that the tradition, which was oral and still in people's memories, would be lost. So it was written down as the Mishnah. Sometimes you may have heard me say, the Mishnah is actually our most important book. And, how can you say that? Well, because all of our traditions about how to understand Torah and so on, and those were all written down then for the first time. And it included some standards for prayer. I didn't go back and extract which ones precisely, but there were some early models. So then we have the Byzantine era, which is, we're now in sort of the beginning of Christian time, and we have Christian authorities. Of course, Rome has expelled Jews from Jerusalem, and there's a lot of persecution and suppression. And some scholars say that because the Christian rulers were outlawing or discouraging Jewish prayer, such as it had developed to that time, there needed to be an alternative. And in Palestine, there were poets who started to develop liturgy as poetry, as a way to have liturgy without it being liturgy, if you will. That theory is not universally accepted, but that's that we don't have a better one that everyone agrees upon. Again, though, we still had this sort of extemporaneous flow, and this we'll see, remain a theme in Palestine, where you allow creativity and you have themes, but it's not tightly controlled. Now, in about the year 400, the Palestine Talmud, if you don't know, there were two Talmuds, not just one developed in Palestine, and one, the rabbis, the ancestors of the rabbis who had remained in Babylonia, they developed one, and the rabbis in Palestine developed one. And there was communication back and forth, but still they were separate.
Physically, where is Babylonia, or West Babylonia?
In Iraq.
Okay.
So in about 400 is when the Palestinian Talmud was finalized. And we have this account that a rabbi named Ashi, who died in 425, went to a local synagogue one day and was asked, please, would you please recite the Kiddusha Rabbah? He never heard of that, but he made one up. And the story is that he looked at an elder, he this is over the wine, and he says the Berei Pri Hagafen, he sort of makes it up, and he looks over to see how it's received, and the elder, nods, good. And so he's relieved that apparently it's within the tradition of this synagogue. And that his prayer becomes the standard which we still use. Sort of made up on the spot. Okay, interesting story. Whether it's true, I don't know, but it shows, even at that time, what the situation was. So then the Babylonian Talmud, which when people say the Talmud, that's what we're really talking about, because it became the standard. And it also contains numerous blessings and prayers, possibly reflecting the need for structure. Okay, now we're starting to get close to the serious evolution of a Siddur. In 632, Muhammad dies, and Islam amazingly captures much of the known world in an incredibly short time. And in 750, in a key event for Jewish history, Baghdad is established, and a new monarchy takes over called the Caliph, or the Caliphate is the monarchy. And the Caliph is the head of both the secular and religious matters. And this is, we can talk about this at some other time when we talk about the history of Judaism in general, but I'll just digress for a moment and say that in general, Jews fared much better under Islam than they did under Christianity. Not that life was always so great under Islam, we were second-class citizens and sometimes persecuted, but we were still respected as people of the book. That came from Islam. And so this time here is one of the golden ages of Judaism under Islam. And there was great centralization under the Caliph, who, as the head of Islam, dictated how everything was supposed to be done by Muslims under this Caliphate control. And the rabbis seize on this opportunity and this model set by the Caliph to exercise control over Jewish ritual. And they set themselves up, and with the approval of the Caliph, as a gaon, which means excellency. And I remember in rabbinical school hearing stories of how, in other words, read the book of Esther, where Haman led Mordecai on a horse, through the town. Well, the Gaons apparently were also treated that way. They were highly respected, and they rode horses, and they had, of course, they didn't have any secular control, but they were respected as the authoritative rulers of Judaism. You had a centralized single Gaon who was the chief Jew, if you will, in this empire. And this was a very powerful empire, and they had a lot of technology for the day. They had scribes, and they had distribution systems, and they had all sorts of things which didn't exist in Palestine, which was under the Christian control. So the Gaons would start dictating what the laws of Judaism should be, including prayer ritual. In Palestine, the rabbis were saying, thank you, but we have our own. And so they really didn't listen too much. And how do we know that all these local customs in Palestine existed? We didn't really know until the Cairo Geniza was excavated at the beginning of the 19th century, right? Solomon Schechter, do I have the right, or was that the beginning of the 20th century? I think it was the beginning of the 20th century. He took everything back to Oxford, was it? And yeah. Okay. Anyway, but it was this treasure trove in Cairo that was only discovered, a century ago, that we started learning about what the traditions were in Palestine. Yeah.
Not to digress, but I think the thing on the Geniza is so interesting in that with our technology today, they have been able to, or they're in the process of scanning each and every piece. And they have software that can put this piece with this piece as being the same author. And they're taking all these bits and pieces and actually now putting the documents together.
I saw some kind of a documentary program on that process used for the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, is that right?
So,
okay.
Yeah, but you're right. They take images of scraps and then they merge them together. It's very interesting. Yeah. Okay, so then a key date in 860, the Jews in Spain write to the Gaon in Baghdad. His name was Amram. And they say, how do we, what are we supposed to say? What kind of rituals should we do for prayers? And the Gaon is a very self-important, authoritative guy, being the chief rabbi, if you will, of the empire. And so he takes this opportunity to basically write a prayer book full of instructions about what to do. And the technology, and this is just being at the right place in the right time, has developed not the printing press is still a long way, it's still 1,000 years or almost 1,000 years away, but they are starting to develop books that they can transcribe, which are far easier to use and to transport apparently than scrolls. So he makes up this book, this prayer book, and while he's doing it, he writes in the commentary, "Don't do it like the Palestinians do it." He writes it in Aramaic, which was the language that the Talmud had been written in, and that the Jews in Spain understood. Okay, and so this book becomes a standard. It's really the first Siddur, and because he's an opponent of what's going on in Palestine, he doesn't include their stuff. And this idea, and he's very authoritarian, and he's trying to create a standard, and he doesn't like the idea in Palestine anyway of this extemporizing over a theme. So Palestine sort of gets shunted off.
Excuse me, is
Yeah.
that writing on animal skins?
Yes,
Ah.
as far I believe it. I believe it is. Yeah, I think so, but I'm not 100% sure. Let me check and let you know what I find out. I don't know when was paper introduced or piracy. Yeah.
When,
Yeah.
yeah, it was in
Yeah.
China.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, but paper disintegrates. The problem is the skins
Yeah.
withstand moisture and other things. And when they had, Rabbi As's son was there. All the Torahs are written on.
I'm remembering that in Rashi's time in France, which was like 1100. He was talking about. In fact, in the book, what's her name? Who wrote Rashi's Daughters? Doesn't she describe the process of sewing skins together for books and things like that? So it seems likely that it was
The
animal
actual
skins.
books were,
Yeah,
were
What was
skins.
the Dead Sea
Yeah.
Scrolls on?
on parchment. Yeah.
Which is,
On animal skin.
Animals, yeah.
the parchment is animal skin and not paper?
Yes. Okay.
They were paper that had been gone and never.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine what life was like before the printing press. How hard it was, and how expensive things, any printed materials were. And of course, many people couldn't read, and maybe that was part of it. There were no books. How would you teach them?
There was nothing to read, so.
Well, except the Bible. But and so the priests were educated. Now Jews learned how to read because it was obligatory to learn how to read Torah. Yeah.
But women, just men.
Well,
Why would women need to
sure
know how to read?
all of the merchants along the trade routes used Hebrew.
Yeah. Well, I remember Rashi taught his daughter how to read. Do you remember that? Yeah, it was really.
That's revolutionary.
Yeah, it was revolutionary.
Okay, so now in 910, maybe the most famous Gaon, Sadia Gaon, well later Vilna Gaon.
Rabbi?
Gaon is excellency. It's the Jewish counterpart of the Caliph. The head Jew
Big head,
in
head honcho.
in the empire.
Not necessarily the most learned.
Well, he would be appointed. Actually, I think there were different ways. Sometimes it was hereditary, and sometimes it wasn't. Because when the Karaite movement started, it was because there was a dispute over which of two sons would become the Gaon, and the Do you know, when I said the Karaite movement, I think I skipped over that.
There was
Do
some
you-
mention of it, I think.
Yeah,
very
okay, sorry, let
before.
me jump back to that. So, does anybody know who the Karaites
No.
were? You wanna, Alex, you wanna mention that?
Well, those are Jews who thought that Jews supposed to adhere only to Torah, and they basically rejected Talmud.
Right.
Right.
So,
What was the first Torah?
the first Torah? You mean when was the whole Torah canonized?
Well, yeah, and was the Ten Commandments the first pieces?
Ah, well, okay, so you mean how did, well, that's, that's subject to a lot of debate. I mean, God dictated the whole thing on Sinai. I don't understand the question.
So Moses carried it down the whole.
Anyway, well, I mean, it depends on who you believe, and the document's a documentary hypothesis, and then there are those who've studied the grammar, and they say that the first 4 books, pieces of the books come from earlier times: Song of Songs, Song of the Sea. There's poetry, and these
So is that time
reflect
zero?
ancient time zero. We think, for example, that the Torah as we know it was completed by 500 BCE when Ezra and Nehemiah came back from Persia. They brought with them the Torah as we know it, and then because there's accounts that talk about them reading to the people, and the people didn't understand, and they had to be translators because they had lost the Hebrew; they only understood Aramaic. Okay, so then later the second book, Prophets, is canonized, and then ultimately Ketuvim, the third book, the writing, is canonized. So that's when you say, when did we get the Torah? Are you talking about as we know it today, or the pieces of it, or early? It's complicated history.
But the Torah is not really a history book.
Well, the Torah has been described in many ways. I mean, the Torah has... Well, go ahead. What do you mean by that?
Well, the fact is that it doesn't follow chronologically all the events in terms of sequencing as we would normally look at history or events taking place. And books aren't necessarily in the chronological order of events anyway. So it's, who created the sequence and what, I mean, Torah is supposed to be a learning tool, giving lessons relative, not necessarily depicting the history of the Jews and so on.
But it does, some of the things in the Torah have actually been substantiated. There is some things that seem to have been historical.
Oh, I'm not saying they're not historical, I'm just saying, but it's not a historical book in terms of sequence of history,
Right.
events.
Chapter 1, chapter 2.
Right. I remember one of my Bible teachers said the Bible is a book in what was the word he used? In conversation with itself. Many different writers who are talking and answering to each other, telling different stories in different ways, and so on. So I think it is in part it's a history book, and part it's reflecting theology and politics, literature. Very complicated. Okay, anyway, just to finish for a moment about the Karaites. So, as Alex said, the Karaites were a movement that started when one of the Gaons died and didn't have a clear successor. And I think I have a date mentioned here. Yeah, 750. They actually, one of the sons was, the older son was considered the smarter son, but he had studied in Palestine and was considered tainted. And so there was a movement of people who, as Alex said, rejected the whole idea of the Talmud. Judaism is about Torah, not about what this whole convoluted set of things the rabbis have created that don't make sense and don't seem supported by the Bible. And so one example, the Torah says, "Do not kindle a flame on Shabbat." So the Karaites said that means no fire on Shabbat, only cold food, and sitting shivering in your in your hut or whatever it is. the Karaites also said, and by the way, the word Karaite comes from the word for scripture. So they were focusing directly on that. The point was, the stuff made up by the rabbis is not legitimate. They also said, for example, nowhere does it say we can't have milk and meat. It said don't boil a kid in your mother's milk. That doesn't mean you can't have milk and meat at the same meal. So they would permit that. But other things they were stricter about, because the rabbis who had to build a society changed many things from the text in Torah to create more livability. And so, I used the example of the flame. The rabbi said, well, you can't actually light it on Shabbat, but if it's lit before Shabbat, you can keep it burning, during Shabbat. So the Karaites were strict about some things and not others. And their movement was a real challenge to Rabbinic Judaism. They got very strong for a couple hundred years, and Saadia Gaon was the most important opponent. And did I say in here, he also wrote a prayer book, but he wrote it in Arabic, or he wrote the commentary in Arabic, because he had come from Egypt. He was the first non-Babylonian Gaon. He had gone to Egypt, and then he went to Palestine, and then he was appointed, because of his brilliance, he was appointed the Gaon in Babylonia. But he wrote a prayer book about 50 years later after Amram, and because he wrote it in the commentary in Arabic rather than Aramaic, it was not accepted by the Jews in Europe, unfortunately, since he was so brilliant. But he was successful in beating off the Karaite challenge, and Rabbinic Judaism survived, and of course that's what we have now. And there's only a remnant of Karaites.
There is still some Karaites left. Yeah, I read there is one temple in San Francisco.
There is
some in Europe.
Yeah, and there are some in Jerusalem too.
Yeah.
I've never been to a service, but they developed their own liturgy, and
So it must be a
interesting.
a shorter service.
Not necessarily. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But they did. They came up with some wonderful. I've read some really penetrating and wonderful Bible commentaries, because of course they were focused on what does the text of the Torah mean. Yeah.
A quick question. Maybe it sounds strange, but Karaites. How it would be in Hebrew plural? Is there plural?
Karaim. Kara.
It
Kara.
wouldn't be feminine, it would be the team, right?
You mean the name of the movement? Leak. Okay, so the reason that to read in Hebrew, likro is the word to read and to call, and mikra is the word that means scripture. So, so you're asking me how would you mean?
The reason I'm asking, I know that in the south of Russia there were Karaims.
Oh, interesting.
And they were, so I'm just, it's probably the same. It's probably the same. Because they were not exactly Jews, but they were kind of.
Is that group that was converted, the Ural?
No.
That's not that group.
No.
Why do you say they weren't exactly Jews?
Well, they were, because Jews did not recognize them as Jews.
Ah, so other Jews didn't recognize them.
Other Jews, and they,
Okay.
and actually they were like, what you call it?
Like I think of the Samaritans are another group
Right.
who only consider themselves the only true Jews.
Yeah, and also, well, in former Soviet Union, everybody was by nationality. People were divided by nationality, so their nationality was, they were not Jews, they were Karaims. So I'm just wondering, it's probably the same.
So the Soviet government didn't consider them Jews; they considered them
Yeah.
Karaim.
Yeah.
Interesting. Why don't you do some research on that and let us know in 2 weeks? Okay. All right. So so now we have this standardized Siddur, which had been written by this Amram Gaon fellow. So when you think about it, I mean, it had if you go back to the destruction of the temple and the exile and so on, if the Jews had never had been exiled to Babylonia, we wouldn't have that Talmud, and we wouldn't have our Siddur. It goes back to the destruction of the first temple. I mean, the sequence of events. Isn't it interesting? And what we have doesn't come from Israel. It comes from Babylonia. In fact, they rejected what was in Israel or in Palestine. Okay. So, all right, so now we're on page 3, and we have we're getting into the sort of modern or the medieval ages with the Crusades. And the Jews, the Crusaders take over, they reach Palestine, and they expel the Jews for about a century. The Jews are able to come back, but by that time they had already adopted the Amram Siddur, or code. So that basically was the end of the Palestinian creativity, extemporization sort of idea that had been our tradition for 3,000 years or so. So local customs are established still. There are scribes that are doing things and making some changes, although there's much standardization. But the sort of death knell of creativity was with the printing press and movable type. Because then any printer could lay out a plate and print out any number of books, and whoever was the best marketer, the best price, or it's like today. I mean, who determines what books get sold? There's a lot of different factors, economics and so on, distribution methods, or at least before the internet. Let's say. I mean, who used to decide? I distinctly remember, I don't remember where it was, but I think in one of my classes the question was asked, who was the most important person who determined the contents of the Siddur? The printer. Or whoever was doing it for the printer decided, what am I going to put in this book and what I'm not. Whatever they put in, whether it was right, wrong, creative, standard, things they liked from there, whatever it was. If it sold, that became the standard. Okay, so then in 1500, now we're talking about the expulsion from Spain, the whole Inquisition and all that, and the turmoil for Jews in the Mediterranean. And many Jews escaped, all different places, but some went back to Palestine and settled in Sfat. And who's been to Sfat other than several of us? Okay, fascinating place. It's in northern Israel.
I think you were there probably.
It's way up at the top of a high hill, or a mountain for Israel, I guess you'd call it. It's imbued with this sort of spiritual feeling.
Has a bunch of little synagogues in it.
Yeah, very ancient synagogues that date from this time. Okay, where you had these rabbis who were dealing with the implications of the Inquisition and expulsion. And one of or maybe the principal movement that developed was Kabbalah, which is a form of Jewish mysticism. Not the only one. We have it going all the way back to Ezekiel and the chariot and Merkavah mysticism and so on. But there was a type of Jewish mysticism that developed that tried to explain the whole situation of the expulsion from Spain and what had happened, and characterized the universe as broken. We're going to have a separate class if you want on Kabbalah. But for our purpose today, the point is that their influence, their sort of idea that there was a secrets to the universe that could be revealed from the printed word and from letters, and they created prayers. And they had interpretations and meditations on these prayers to discover the true meaning of the Torah and God and existence and the universe. And their movement became very powerful. In so much so that although we think today of Kabbalah as kind of this, bizarre, odd,
Madonna.
but back then, Kabbalah actually became mainstream Judaism.
But
It
wasn't
was
there
mainstream Judaism.
the situation that theoretically you weren't allowed to get into the Kabbalah mysticism level until you were a certain age?
Yeah, you don't
40
just
years
study,
old,
right,
and
right.
studied so many years or whatever.
Right.
You weren't entitled to the privilege of
Well, it was dangerous too. This knowledge was dangerous. You couldn't be. It was dangerous for you and for everyone else if the secrets of the universe and its energy and power were revealed to you. You couldn't handle it. Okay, but that movement was able to. The rabbis started printing their own Siddurim, and because Kabbalah was so influential, their Siddurim were widely disseminated, and so now we had different versions. And ultimately, which we'll discover as we eventually, hopefully, someday talk about Friday night services. And we're going to be using the morning service as our model. But the prayers like Lahadodi, that's Kabbalistic. And you study, what's that all about? About the queen. We stand up and we turn around the Sabbath queen and we bow and all that. Okay, this comes from Sfat, in the 15th century. And so this is why, in sort of presenting this class, I had talked about, we learn about Jewish history in the Siddur. And we certainly, when we get to prayers that have these mystical implications, that comes from this period. Okay, so then 1600, the power of the printing press, which we've talked about, distribution, and whoever who prints the books controls people and what's going on. So there's a lot of struggle. And we almost had the first Jewish prayer book that was authorized by a group of Jews instead of just individual rabbis or the Gaons, and that was in Poland. But due to infighting and due to persecution, that was unsuccessful. And so the last account, modernly, after the Enlightenment and so on, and the emergence of our streams of Judaism, it became sort of mandatory for each rabbi to write their own siddur, reflecting their own view. And
congregations write their own.
And still happens now. So we have these, maybe you've heard of these, Minhag America, Isaac Meyer Weiss, and the Union Prayer Book, and I'm only going to list a few, Sim Shalom, and of course now we have many different Orthodox prayer books and so on. So this was just a superficial, quick run through. But I think it's interesting to show that our Siddur comes from Babylonia and the influence of the printing press and those sorts of things. And how it used to be not fixed. We had this tradition of extemporizing, and that got suppressed because of events that happened. Palestine ceased to be relevant, and they didn't have power. And so that tradition was lost to us. So. Any questions or comments before we leave this?
When did we start Friday night prayers?
When did we start Friday night prayers?
When
Yeah, on Friday night.
Friday night services.
I don't know the answer to that. Let me check into it, and I'll get you an answer in 2 weeks. I have books on the evolution of the Friday night services. I mean, one could say that traditionally there were to be 3 sacrifices a day, and an extra one on Shabbat and on holidays. You had Ma'ariv, and then you had in the evening, you had Shachrit in the morning, and you had Mincha in the afternoon. These were sacrifices. They're talked about in the Torah. And so when the prayers were established after the destruction of the Second Temple, there must have been a prayer established to substitute for the Friday night or the evening, not just Friday night, but every evening service. because the evening sacrifice could no longer be done because there was no temple. So my guess would be we started with the Friday night service, back in the Mishnah days.
Well, when they started electricity, no?
Why? Why do you say that?
Would people gather at night?
Yeah.
Sure, there were yet oil flames. Remember the Chanukia, right? I mean,
We didn't
people
know about
read at
electricity.
night. Yeah. I don't know. Ben Franklin, I don't think he was around back then. But I mean, it just, you're right. It's hard to imagine, even for us, what was life like before there was electric light. I mean, did people do anything at night?
But honestly,
They went to sleep early.
Yeah.
we've lived through a major transformation with the computer. So we know before computer, after computer.
Right.
We really can make a
Okay.
comparison that way.
And thank you for mentioning that, because I forgot. I wanted to say that, what I presented so far was we started out with total flexibility, and then over the millennia, flexibility and creativity got suppressed, and we were left with, a standardized version. And then in the last 200 years, due to emancipation and the emergence of the movements, we had more Siddurim. But now, with the computers and the internet, anybody can write their own Siddur. And not just any congregation, but anybody. I mean, I've got a software. I mean, you can buy Dafka software that has the prayers that you can cut and paste.
The Herod, actually, the Chabad, Lapi has it on his little pad.
Yeah.
All the prayers.
So,
He's got
like,
the
for
Torah,
example,
the whole
right,
nine.
I do too. And
You get
so
to use that on Saturday.
No, but I joked with him. I said, could you, he can't turn it with his hand. But I said, could you do it a voice command? And he said, no, it's the same, baloney about,
Funny.
so.
But I mean, so I haven't created a Siddur for my own use, but I have created for a Passover Seder. Thank you. I was having a senior moment here. What is that thing called?
Doesn't everybody have their own family?
Yeah, right. So I've cut and pasted prayers. So we're now in a new era of incredible creativity again, and it's a challenge for our tradition. Do we continue with these prayers that date back to Babylonia?
Well,
Or
women
do we
have
make
been
up our
doing it
own?
for quite a while, creating their own prayers.
Yeah, but not on a regular basis. It's usually for a
No.
holiday or for something special.
No,
They have their
meetings
own.
in their own homes. They don't necessarily have a temple.
There is a program, by the way, relative to writing new Sefer Torahs, that actually, after they complete the Torah, that they actually can scan it and make sure that all the wording is correct.
Yeah, really?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Wow, but they can't.
A sofer is.
But of course it still has to be handwritten.
Yeah, it's all
Yeah,
handwritten,
yeah.
but the idea it is scanned and so on there to see that all the lettering is proper.
Wow.
What if you make a mistake? Is the whole thing thrown out, the whole time?
No, they
No.
cut
They
that
cut
part
Cut out
out.
that
It's like
section.
spell check.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's always interesting. I don't know if you've heard this story before, but so how do you determine whether a Torah is kosher or not? Do you know how to do that? What's supposed to happen is the rabbi, whoever is reading along,
Good housekeeping.
and and suddenly sees that there's a question about a letter. Or maybe it's become faded, or there's a mark, whatever. And what is it? It's not clear. You're supposed to call up a child and say, "What letter is that?" A child who can read but doesn't know the what it actually
Knows the
says.
letters.
Yeah, knows the letters. Excuse me. And if the child can correctly identify it, then it's okay.
Interesting.
So maybe that's also part of having the children feel important and involved, but that's the test.
There was a very big Reform temple in the Detroit area, in West Bloomfield, where we lived. And I don't know when it started, but they had their own prayer book. 30 years ago.
Hmm.
They had,
Interesting.
there's like 3,000 members.
Wow.
I mean, it's huge.
3,000 members?
It's
How many
huge.
rabbis?
4, I think. And people love it. I mean, they have 3 different services on
Rosh
Rosh
Hashanah.
Well,
Hashanah.
that's the whole thing, right.
You know,
I guess
So
that's-
you miss that.
Right,
Seeing-
that's,
I actually have a suggestion, and I don't know if any of you want to do
I
this.
never went to service, you know.
But here's my suggestion. Okay, I was just about to tell you we have an option for where we go from here. But I think it would be a great thing if each of you brought a little notebook to make your own prayer book. Now, this sounds like a lot of work, but what I'm suggesting is, as we go through the prayers, condense them for yourself into a few sentences or something in English that just gives you the highlight of how you felt or what it means or the main theme. And then at the end, or whenever we're finished or whenever you want, you'll have an abridged prayer book that you made up that tells you what the themes of the prayer are that you're saying. I think it would be so meaningful to have that, and maybe pass it along to your children or whatever.
Is that almost like a devout Torah for each prayer?
Something like sure. That. I mean, But, should we have that be? That's my recommendation. I'm not going to make it an assignment, but I think it would be really nice. So we're going to, the first prayer we're going to study is Ma Tovu. And so if you had something, even if you're in the synagogue and along with the prayer book, you have your little notes. Oh, I remember this is when I studied this. This is the key point I want to get out of this. Even if it takes you 10 seconds to read it, it'll be much more meaningful for you as you're saying the prayer. And then when you create, eventually you'll have a full prayer book. Maybe it's only 2 pages long, but it'll have, your condensed version. Anyway, that's my recommendation. Okay, so I've got, what do we have? We have 20 minutes.
Did you want to pass on the book?
So I have two things that we can do. And since we have a short time, I think it'll tell me what we do. But I have the whole structure of the morning service, which I thought we could run through. It's 2 pages, and it kind of sets up, where we're going to go before we actually dive into prayer number 1.
Which version of morning service?
The traditional daily morning
What does
service.
that mean? Conservative?
Well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk
Do
about
you
that.
have
Okay.
the Masaf and
No, this is the morning. The morning daily, the daily morning. Okay,
Preliminary,
daily morning.
preliminary to the Shachrit?
We'll see. We'll talk about it. Okay, you'll see.
Reading it as a
Okay, all
surprise.
right. Or so we can go through that and talk about it. Or we can, if you're anxious to actually dive in, then we can look at Ma Tovu, which is only a few verses long. And I also thought that they're schlepping their Siddurim. I ought to at least let them,
Right.
use them. We could talk about the first prayer, just to kind of get your feet wet and see, So, how many want to go through Ma Tovu, the verses, and then talk about what the themes are, and how many would prefer to go through the structure of the service?
Sounds like the prayer would
I like the
be better.
prayer.
Do the prayer.
It would
Okay.
fit the
Do
time
the prayer?
that we
Okay,
have.
yeah, okay. So I think, we still have to hurry a little bit, but we can get there. And if you want to stay a few minutes, Lil, if we don't have to end right at, then it's up to you. Okay, so if you have a Siddur with you, why don't you get it? And if you don't, then I have a few copies here. That, for those who do not have a Siddur, I've got some extra copies also. Anyone will do. If you prefer just to have a sheet of paper,
Yeah.
I only
Do
made.
you need a prayer book or?
I knew that we'd have. I don't even. Thank you. I knew that we had a number of Siddurim, so
You give me back my book?
they're not the same prayer book, but they all should have it in
Said you
there.
didn't have the conservative one.
which
We
one?
have all those
Well, there's a
conservative
conservative one, here's a conservative one,
Yeah.
here's a conservative one.
ones.
Okay.
yeah.
Three.
Doesn't matter. Go to the beginning of the morning service.
I'd love that. Well, thank you.
Anybody want the on a sheet of paper? Or
It's got my name in
okay.
there.
All right.
Does it really?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All
we
right.
were choosing between which 2 prayer books.
So,
we used.
okay. So, so I'm going to give you a treat. I'm going to sing it. It's wonderful. Now they're different. New sock, different themes. I don't have a guitar,
Which page? Oh,
but
We're leaving.
the way that
Is morning Meacham or?
morning is Shachrit.
looking?
Morning is Shachrit. No, morning is
Oh
Shachrit.
my gosh, I'm never gonna find this.
I'm going to find it for you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which, you have the art
Yeah, because we don't have that page to
To
tell you.
Oh, I see.
Okay,
Not tell.
Shachrit.
It's on page 12.
That depends on which one you're
12
looking at.
on the art scroll. Marilyn, is this one you
Okay,
got?
they're different. They're different. Here, I'm getting it from Marilyn right now.
Oh, I thought you had the, who has the art
She
scroll?
does.
It's on
She
page
does. They're different.
12.
Okay, here you go,
Oh, I
Marilyn.
think.
It's on page 2 in this
Page
version.
12. Yeah,
Okay.
it should be on page 12.
Okay. That's Mincha. Okay.
Is it
Okay.
right?
No,
Well, give me
we-
mine.
This is
12 is Sabbath Eve.
Oh, you have a different book here. Take mine, I'll find it there. That's
Okay,
okay.
preliminary prayers.
Yeah.
I thought we gave the same book.
Okay, so we've learned that this doing it this system may not be the most efficient.
Yeah, 'cause I'm looking at the
And I'm looking for
regular Saturday
I'm looking
morning.
for Shachrit. Okay, there we go, Shachrit. All right, Shachrit.
David, even before the preliminary.
This book is how is this book organized?
This is
It goes right from.
pre-preliminary.
Yeah.
Okay.
You- Where you go depends on where you
So
start.
preliminary prayers. Yeah. Okay, we're almost there. We're almost there.
Some of us.
One more page. There we go. Right there.
Thank you.
Okay. Ma tohu ohaleha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, va'ani berov chastecha avovetecha, eshtachave el hecho kodshecha b'yiratecha. Adonai ahavti me'on betecha, umkom mishkon kevodecha, va'ani eshtachave ve'ekra evrecha lifnei Adonai osi, va'ani tefilati lecha Adonai et ratzon, Elohim berov chaftecha, aneni be'emet ishecha. Now you know why I didn't become a cantor.
No, you did, and you're very good.
Okay, thank you. All right. Traditionally, I mean, way back when, the first prayers, when you wake up, you said Shachrit at home, but it was moved to the synagogue. And so now the idea is, this is the first thing that's happening. We're joining together communally in prayer. And let's look at what's going on here. And there are different translations, of course, but they're fairly, whatever one you look at should be fairly close. So, Ma tovu ohaleha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. How goodly, wonderful, beautiful, something like that, are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. Now, this is the first sentence. Where does this come from? Who is saying it? I mean, we're saying it, but if we know where it comes from, if you know where it comes from, you know who said it.
I'm just going to the map.
Does anybody know who said this? What is happening? Which tense? And who is it who's saying they're wonderful? Okay.
God?
No, not
Tense
God.
in the-
It's
in the
not even
desert?
a Jew. As a matter of fact,
In the
it's
desert?
in the desert. This is being said by a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet, Balaam, who has been hired by the king Balak to curse the Jews. We start our service by repeating the words from a prophet who was set out to curse Jews. Now, is that incredible?
Yes.
Okay. So, the idea, some commentators
So he
have
was
said
pro.
that he opened his mouth, he didn't want to praise God, but that's what came out. He was forced to. And you know what?
God
When we
bless
go
him.
to services, we don't necessarily want to praise God. We don't even want to be in the mood for prayer. We don't want to do anything. But it's our obligation. We have to do it just like he had to do it. That's one interpretation of this. Another one is that when you're in the synagogue, at least when the men are in the synagogue, they're putting on their, at this point, what are they doing? They're putting on their talits, they're getting ready for praying. And they're all paying attention to individually what they're doing is they're putting these things over their head. You know, it's not, we're used to seeing in our synagogue, the talit katan, which doesn't go over the head, it just goes over your shoulder. But the traditional, the talit gadol, is big and you cover your head with it. So it's as if you're making a tent. You're putting this white, creating this white. And if somebody were in the back or on the top of a mountain looking down and they saw all these people creating tents, they might say, it's really beautiful how you're all creating tents. So there's this imagery in this first sentence.
Well, tent gave you sort of a sense of security.
Okay, right. Okay. And we'll see in this prayer there are repeated references, synonyms for tents, homes, protection, whatever. So apparently one of the things that's going on, and we'll go, is this reference to we're going into a home or shelter. All right? Now, whose home is, so what's the second part? Va'ani berochastecha avo veitecha. And I, in the abundance of your chesed is what?
Compassion.
Right. Loving kindness, compassion, some extremely warm, generous feeling. I am entering your house. Now, note that this is in the first person. We're talking to God. I am doing this, your house. It's a very personal interaction here. Even though we're gathering to do this, we're not in our own homes, and we're in God's house, we're addressing God personally. So we already have this direct sense of direct connection, or we're hoping to establish a direct connection. Okay. And what do I do as I'm entering? Eshtachaveh el hechol kodshecha b'yiratecha. So I am prostrating myself to the temple of your holiness, hechol kodshecha. Remember we talked about the word kodesh last time? Kiddush, kaddish, kodesh. They all come from sanctification. No, sanctification or separation. Okay, you're thinking of Baruch. Okay, all right, which we'll get to shortly. All right. So, and how are we doing this? B'yiratecha. So yira is often translated as fear, but it really means some kind of awe. So it's awesome reverence, awesome, could be trembling. I mean, we're going before the God of the universe. So what do we feel when we enter the God of the universe's house? There's some fear, trepidation, but there's also this direct relationship and this awe already established. And we already have multiple references to the house. Beit is house. Heichal, temple. Okay. Now it's an interesting thing. Count the words of what we just of this verse, starting with va'ani. Actually, let's do it this way. If you're able to, I don't know if everybody can read the Hebrew. So I'll just count for everybody. I'll say, okay. Va'ani barov chastecha avo veitecha eshtachaveh el hechol kodshecha b'yiratecha. How many words is that?
It's 9.
10.
6, 7.
It's 10 words.
El HaKol.
And what is the significance of 10?
Dominion.
Okay. 10 commandments. But in our prayer setting, it's a minyan. Now, in one of our traditions is, and I think it's probably an ancient pagan, comes from an ancient pagan, you don't point at people, because when you point at people, okay, we think of it as rude, right? But I think anciently you drew the attention of the evil eye to someone when you pointed at them. So when we want to make sure that we have a minyan, the tradition is you don't count the people, you count some object like they're wearing or whatever, you know. Well, this is another way. You have,
One, two, you're short too.
well, so one of the things, one of the traditions is you have the people who show up. You say, okay, you say this. One person say a word in a row, and let's see if we can say this verse. And if you can say this verse, you know you have a minyan.
Have you ever seen that done?
No.
No.
Never seen that done.
I was just curious who did that.
Okay, but I like the idea.
Well,
Actually, we
Okay.
give out tickets. When I walk in, here's one, you're number two, you're
Is that-
number three.
is that-
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay,
Couple tickets, you don't
so
count up the place.
all right. So we discovered already that the first verse comes from Torah. Any clues on where this verse, these two verses of this combined verse, might come from? Okay. Actually, yeah. Okay. So it comes from two. Let's go on to the next verse, and then I'll put it all together. So Adonai ahavti me'on beitecha. So God, I love the shelter of your house, something like that.
Does it come from the Psalms?
It does. Very good, Barbara. Okay, Mishkan kivodecha. The Mishkan was the tabernacle of your kavod, your honor. Okay, so, or the residence of your glory, something like that. So these verses come from Psalms. Now, I don't know. Do you want to leave right at? I mean, the two Psalms are actually very short. So what I was thinking of doing was just reading the Psalms to you, if we can do that. Barbara, would you bring me the Tanakh? Is it in the back there, the big thick Tanakh?
No, I think I saw it in the
I might have put it, yeah. And my point of doing this is, back when these prayers were designed, people knew the Psalms, which of course the Psalms are, back from David's time, or ancient, and they knew these things by heart. So if you were to just say a few words of a psalm, people knew the psalm, so it evoked the whole meaning of the psalm just by using these words. So since they're fairly short, I thought let's see what they were talking about. Okay, so the ani beroch hastacha avo vetecha, I come to your house. This with your abundant kindness. So this comes from Psalm 5. So I'll just read this quickly. Give ear to my speech, O Lord, consider my utterance. Heed the sound of my cry, my King and God, for I pray with you. Hear my voice, O Lord, at daybreak. At daybreak I plead before you and wait. Okay, so remember, this is the first prayer in the morning, right? For you are not a God who desires wickedness, evil cannot abide with you. Wanton men cannot endure in your sight. You detest all evildoers, you doom those who speak lies. Murderous, deceitful men the Lord abhors. But I, in distinction to these evil men, through your abundant love enter your house. I bow down in awe at your holy temple. O Lord, lead me along your righteous path because of my watchful foes. Make your way straight before me, for there is no sincerity on their lips. Their heart is filled with malice. Their throat is an open grave, their tongue slippery. Condemn them, O God. Let them fall by their own devices. Cast them out for their many crimes, for they defy you. But let all who take refuge in you rejoice, ever jubilant as you shelter them, and let those who love your name exult in you. For you surely bless the righteous man, O Lord, encompassing him with favor like a shield. Okay, so all that, I am sincere in coming. I'm not like all these evil people, and this is a refuge. These ideas are embedded in the placement of this one verse of 5 words. That's where it's coming from. And people knew this. So then the next 2 sections come from Psalm 26:8. It's about the same length. It says, Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked without blame. I have trusted in the Lord. I have not faltered. Probe me, O Lord, and try me. Test my heart and mind, for my eyes are on your steadfast love. I have set my course by it. I do not consort with scoundrels or mix with hypocrites. I detest the company of evil men and do not consort with the wicked. I wash my hands in innocence and walk around your altar, O Lord, raising my voice in thanksgiving and telling all your wonders. O Lord, I love your temple abode, the dwelling place of your glory. Do not sweep me away with sinners or snuff out my life with murderers who have schemes at their fingertips and hands full of bribes, but I walk without blame. Redeem me, have mercy on me. My feet are on level ground. In assemblies I will bless the Lord. Okay, so that really is in here. Okay, then we get to Va'ani eshtachaveh, I prostrate myself. Ve'echra'ah, I bow. Evrecha, I kneel. There's your word for kneeling, Baruch. Lifnei Adonai Osi, before Adonai my Maker. And that comes from Psalm 95. Which is short, but same way. Come, let us sing joyously to the Lord. Raise a shout for our rock and redeemer. Let us come into his presence with praise. Let us raise a shout for him in song. For the Lord is a great God, the great God of all divine beings. In his hand are the depths of the earth. The peaks of the mountains are his. His is the sea. He made it, and the land which his hands fashioned. Come, let us bow down and kneel, bend the knee before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, for we are the people he tends, the flock in his care. Oh, if you would but heed his charge this day, do not be stubborn as at Meribah, as on the day of Massah in the wilderness. That's a reference to Torah. When your fathers put me to the test, tried me, though they had seen my deeds. 40 years I was provoked by that generation. I thought, they are a senseless people, they would not know my ways. Concerning them I swore in anger, they shall never come to my resting place. Okay. And then Va'ani tefilati lecha Adonai et ratzon. I pray to you, Adonai, at a favorable time, or may this time be favorable. That also comes from a psalm, but that's a very long one, so I won't read that one. Elohim berov chastecha aneni be'emet yishacha. So God, once again referring to God's great chesed, answer me with your salvation, your redemptive, your saving truth. So, how long does it take us when we go to Shabbat morning service, and this is like, 20 seconds or something like that? Okay, so all this is embedded. Coming to the synagogue, feeling reverence, trying to establish a connection with God, distinguishing yourself from evil people, bowing down, asking God to show you mercy, to save you, with revelation of truth. And it's interesting that they were doing this as a community, but everything here is in the first person. It never says, we ask you. Like the Amidah is all in plural. This prayer is all in singular. So, why? So, one commentator says that, Martin Buber actually says, that we begin our communal journeys as individuals, and before we can recognize our relationship with anyone else, like God, we have to establish our own identity. So we have to have the I before the I-thou relationship, is how we put it. So then why do we do it in a group? Because according to Proverbs, a numerous people is the glory of the king. If you want to praise the king, what do? You get a lot of people to show up and have a parade or whatever. You don't go individually. So there's this mixed idea of the individual being in a group, establishing a relationship with God, but the group, the community, praising all, and we're still doing this with humility. So we're bowing.
Or when, at least most of my familiarity with the prayer situation. This part to the preliminary to the part to where we get to the Hodu is done individually in preparation to get to the mass group. Everybody's saying this individually between getting set on the talit, the tefillin, and so on there. It's not, at least I haven't done it within a group. Is that a separation?
Right. No. In fact, when I am in Israel and I go to the conservative synagogue, the collective starts with the daily blessings. It's the same situation. Yeah. So. Okay. So.
It's like you're warming up to get into this.
Yeah. Right. So I mean, we've come. It's early in the morning, and we're warming up, and we're coming into this holy place house. Now, I don't think that I'll ever actually see this done or anybody would put up with it, but I think that what we ought to do before we enter the synagogue is we ought to wash our hands and remove our shoes. Why? Because it gives you a sense of you're entering into a holy place. Okay. So I think it would be a really, even if they give you slippers to wear or something, I mean, it would be a sense of I'm in a different place. I'm in a holy place. I'm in a place where I need to be humble and purified somehow, do something special here. So maybe if I ever have a congregation, if people will allow that, we can do it.
I know people have washed
There you
their
go.
hands. I know people have washed their hands relative to it. And the only time I've seen them walk without the shoes is on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Actually, only on Yom
Oh,
Kippur.
they don't, do they
Oh,
wear sneakers?
no, they wear
Or
sneakers.
No,
don't?
actually, in Chabad, New York, they don't wear shoes at all.
You're
Oh.
kidding, oh my gosh, I have
Even
never
But-
seen
in the
that.
conservative, even with the,
Because I saw the
we were in a
sneakers, no,
conservative.
that's-
Well, people walk
Michigan.
sneakers over there. They walk
That is
to
interesting.
get there,
Yeah.
but a lot of them take it off.
Huh, that's
And
interesting.
certainly when they do the Olenu, a lot of them take off their shoes.
So, I mean, when do you feel, to answer it, but I'm just, if you don't want to, but when you go to synagogue and you say this prayer, do you feel like you've started something? I mean, do you feel a connection with these themes, or maybe a better question is, I hope, and then I guess we can conclude with this, but I hope that if you understand these themes and that and where it comes from, and maybe even go back and read, take a copy of this and maybe read the Psalms or something, read these Psalms, then you will feel more connected and you will feel a start. And it won't just be, well, let's start our service and then there's the first one. I mean, you will actually feel like you've connected with these themes. And when these rabbis of so long ago constructed these few verses out of 4 Psalms and a part of Torah, right in this little bit already, which is a preview. There's so much of Psalms. I mean, sort of a separate topic. Someday read the Psalms. They are fabulous.
I didn't
Yeah,
realize there were so many Psalms until the Reform movement changed their book.
Yeah,
That's
because the
when I
new
realized
Mishkan
that
Tefillah
all the
has a
Psalms,
lot
right,
of,
That's when it hit me what it was really.
really, and
I didn't know.
I remember when I was studying for my my graduate studies in history and taking some religion class, and I'd see some references to the Christian Psalms and so on. And it's a shared tradition, if you will, but it's they're in Hebrew. I mean, there are Psalms, and yet it's a tragedy we don't, other than the 23rd Psalm. That you've heard the joke about the women who go to the rabbi and say, well, Rabbi, I went to a funeral of a Christian and it was so beautiful, and they had this prayer about walking through still waters, and Rabbi, why don't we have anything like that? Well, we have all that. It's right there, and it's in the Siddur too, and we will we'll see where it is. Very beautiful. So. Okay, any comments before I
I'm just curious,
turn off our
whose
recording?
translation is this?
That translation is a combination of I started with the translation from the My People's Prayer Book compilation, which is I show you in the first session. There are various commentators, historical liturgy and women's and other people. And then I went to the Art Scroll Siddur, because I wanted to, and that's why some of the times I have brackets, which I thought was a more literal translation. I'm really trying to get you as much of a literal translation as possible. Because everybody interprets it their own way, and even calling it literal is, what is a literal translation? There's no such thing as a literal translation. It's a different language. Every translation is an interpretation. But at least I'm trying to be as close as I can get to what I think it, quote, actually says. And then we can vary from there. Okay, so thank you.
Thank
And I'll turn this off now.